Hi guys, welcome back to SSA Athletics, and today we're going to be talking about the off-season. What is the off-season in athletics, and how you can better manage it to make yourself a better athlete. The off-season is a period after the conclusion of the season where athletes will decrease the amount of sport-specific skills, i.e. running, throwing, jumping, and for the most part athletes will try and continue with a more general fitness. Basically, it's a period where the athlete has a rest. Now, as mentioned, the off season is often compared to as a period where the athletes will take a break or take a rest from the track and field athletics. Although this is true for the most part, what they actually do is decrease the workloads on the track and start to do more general fitness work, running, swimming, etc. And the training is less intense and is less frequent. This allows the body to recover from the hard, long season and pre-season winter training. The winter training itself is some of the most important training in a track and field athletic season. We split our season up. Pre-season is the winter season, the winter training. This often will last from around about October time to the start of the season itself, depending on if you're doing a winter athletics indoor season. The season itself will last roughly from April to September, and that short block in between is the off season, between the winter training and the summer season. This planning of the training is known as a periodization, and periodization itself can be broken down into macro, micro and mesocycle. Macro cycles refer to the longest block of training. A macro cycle refers to the overall training period, usually representing a year or two. Olympic athletes will often have what they call an Olympic cycle, which is 4 years long, sometimes even longer to 8 years long, and this is more of a career-based macro cycle. Now, sometimes this is due to necessity, due to funding, and this cycle is between the Olympic periods. Mesocycles are 4 to 8 week blocks within the macro cycle and are typically referred to as either blocks or rotations if we are referring to block periodization. Now, don't worry about what block periodization is. That's something for another video and not something we're going to discuss here today. Microcycles are the smallest parts of a macro cycle. They often can be referred to anything from a session or 3 days of training and rest, because rest is just as important as the training, to potentially 2 weeks. Now, if you want to know more about the periodization and how to plan your periodization, hopefully by the time I mention this, there will be a video right up there for you to have a look at. A typical block will often look like a 4 to 3 weeks of progressive overloading your body to help gauge it with a stimulus, to help encourage growth and gains, and to improve fitness, with the 4th week or beyond the 4th week focusing on recovery. Now, at some point an athlete will have to peak, and that's the point where they have to be at their best performance. Now, generally we will try and peak towards a major competition such as the Olympics, World Athletics Champs, whatever. Sometimes an athlete will need to peak twice, and what we're trying to do at that point is peak them for a important competition in the winter season. Now, some athletes will try and work through the winter season to help them get ready for the summer season, and they might not necessarily like to do a winter indoor season, but that will be depending on the athlete. However, there is no debate on one thing, and winter training is the most important training. Athletes don't just rest and have a holiday in the winter. That's the time they're preparing, because the time they spend on the track, working hard, training smart over the winter, is the very part that will give them the strength and endurance to perform at their best during the summer. Often the winter training is the hardest, and that is for a reason. The off-season is often seen as the least important part of a cycle. Yeah, it is. Some people don't even include it in their cycles of training. However, it's often the most neglected part of a cycle. And I personally think if you neglect it too much, you're making it harder then to get into winter training. Winter training is hardest, and the first session is the hardest still. Even though it might not be hard technically on paper compared to what you're doing in the rest of the winter, it's hard for the fact that your body's been hit with this stimulus and it's like, woo, what have I got to do here? And your body's not used to it. Well, not used to it up until that point in time. So if we can try and prepare ourselves for the winter training without necessarily doing full athletics track training, it can stead us best to get us to fitness quicker during the winter. It can also allow them time to work on things that they are weak on that we probably wouldn't normally be able to work on during the season, or they should be working more so in the season. So for me, my arms are my weakest part, so that's the very thing I try and work on. You can also work on things that you don't normally do and probably wouldn't recommend to do during the season. So for a sprinter, going for, let's say 3 long runs is not going to do any harm during the off season, but might do and might harm their gains during the season. In the modern era, quite a lot of elite athletes will have their training planned for in the off season to help them get back quicker. Not all, but many. Now, what most training programs will have is either 1 or 2 weeks of a break where they're not really doing anything at all, they're just literally resting. And then what they then do is they would maybe have 2 to 3 weeks of an actual exercise that built up and is progressive, progressing them towards the winter season. Because sometimes if you just jump from nothing to something, it's a lot harder transition, and it might make that transition to super fitness is what you're trying to achieve a lot harder. Renato Canovia, one of the world's best marathon coaches, probably said it best when he said it at the Let's Run forum. When it comes to off-season training, there is no hard and fast rule about what you can do, what kind of sports you can play, and what you do in that off-season. It all comes down to a certain number of things. Firstly, personal preference. What do you like to do? What do you think will work best for you? Another thing that will indicate what you can do, what competitions you got up, and how your coach is programming and planning your training sessions to make sure that you do peak at the correct and right time. Another thing that will dictate what you do and what you don't do and how you do your off season is which part of the hemisphere you're in. Are you in the northern hemisphere or are you in the southern hemisphere? Because in the southern hemisphere their season's slightly different, and you can't exactly take, say for instance, 6 months off if you got a national championships in the early March and then you've got the Olympics in the same year. The Olympics is normally in July and August, so you can't exactly take a month off at the end of the season. You just have to keep going or program your training to best meet your needs. Like most things regarding psychology, it is often neglected, and when it comes to planning an off season, it's often neglected how we feel up here. Often athletes may get mentally tired, psychologically tired, so coming psychologically off of that intense, and sport is intense at the elite level, that intenseness, that constantly having to be on the ball, just driving off and just letting that person enjoy themselves, let them eat what they more or less what they want and do things that they wouldn't normally do, can be beneficial, can be like a rest, a break, helps them, potentially makes them a better athlete when they come back on it again in the winter season. The off season allows them a time to just be able to switch off and just not think about athletics for a little while. Another thing most athletes will seem to neglect is nutrition. In the off season, you can potentially do what you like, more or less. You got that freedom, that wiggle room to eat what you like and do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do, like go out partying or clubbing. Nonetheless, when you are in the off season and you're doing less exercise, you will inevitably put a little bit of weight on. And what you risk potentially doing is making it harder for you to get back to that peak fitness when you do go into the winter training. Now guys, for anyone listening that, please, whatever you do, don't get too worried or hung up about one's weight, especially when you're an athlete. You're generally going to be really fit and healthy. It's got to be fun. It's enjoyable. This is athletics. This is track and field, and this is what we enjoy doing. Don't get too worried or hung up about certain things like that. And if you are, there are services out there to help you with it. Now guys, I hope you really enjoyed this video. Smash the subscribe. Check out our YouTube and Facebook. Check out our Facebook pages both for training and for the club itself. I'm Adam McCarthy of SSA Athletics. Check out the website and I will see you in the next one.